at this particular building, which will serve as a case study planned project for what I hope will become a dissertation chapter for my dissertation on repurposing in the former Bophuthatswana Bantustan, more broadly defined. And this planned project is the Mmabatho Civic Center, now called the Mahikeng Local Municipality Civic Center. And it's pictured here on the left. And as part of this complex, called the Kotla Plaza, and you can see it here at right. And on this rainy day, amidst a downpour, the Kotla Plaza, as one might see, was actively being used as a public space. I interviewed someone enjoying some Kentucky Fried Chicken, procured from the Mega City Mall complex as also part of the Civic Center. I also talked to someone waiting in line to ready their RDP or Reconstruction and Development Program housing application. And then a final man that I spoke with said that he's here often. He comes most days. And so reflecting on the Kotla, I had a walkabout interview with a local resident historian and activist. And he told me about how the Kotla is an ethnic Tswana architectural feature. He told me, quote, to really understand the Kotla, you have to speak to someone who is Tswana, someone like me, to get that perspective. Most of the Tswana villages, they have a central kraal. This is really where the ancestors would reside. There's also usually a lapa, a veranda, or stoop placed before the door of the house, a breezeway built to be a sort of entrance. It's a Tswana architectural feature. Look out for one always. It's like a reception area. Even traditional Tswana marriage laws have one. And then with describing the roof but open air, he said it's a great natural air conditioner. These were always made with a particular kind of clay soil, never with cement. It's an indigenous knowledge system. However, with some follow-up questions, I asked about the materiality of this particular Kotla, because as we might see from the image, it's not just using low clay soil. In fact, it uses steel and cement in various ways. And this local activist responded as follows. Well, with places like the Civic Center, these were built during the erstwhile Bantustan era. In fact, mostly by Israeli companies. As South Africans, we don't know how to change the craftsmanship. That's why we have to keep it as it was. Actually, Mangope actually sent people, even Israelis, to the rural villages to observe a real Kotla he wanted them to understand. And so, of course, in this particular response, we see the links between the former Bophuthatswana government and the state of Israel, which is something that Ariana has discussed in other published work as well. But this particular project was not actually an Israeli constructed project. It was constructed by a firm, Stocks and Stocks, that was Johannesburg-based and continues to have a large, in part out of Gauteng. But nonetheless, I argue that the Civic Center and other state-sponsored public architectural projects like it are key articulations in a regime that we might call racial modernism. And folks like Alan Mabin, Noor Niftakhodian, and others have written about this term racial modernism. And, you know, we might naively presume that, like a lot of the historiography about apartheid, it might have been a principally ideological or normative project. But in this dissertation chapter, I seek to argue that central to racial modernism was an additional layer, graft and corruption for a wide-ranging yet specific network of planners, architects, engineers, what I like to discuss modernism and capitalist profit as achieved through urban planning. And this is, of course, not at all unique to Mmabatho or to present-day Mahikeng. You could look at urban planning in New York and find a similar set of relationships. But I think given the historical legacies of nostalgia for a material-built environment among my interviewees in Mmabatho, I think it's particularly important to identify these connections and understand that planning, urban planning, played a dual role in this Bantustan historically. Perception of legitimacy of what was really a sham nation-state construction complicit in apartheid-era separate development on the one hand, and two, kind of sin and protest, and that would pave the way to repurposing. And so my arguments are that contestation in the late 1980s through the People's for not coincidental that these contestations took place in the very built environment that was built through this graft-ridden racial modernist planning regime. So my broader dissertation project asks two research questions. Change those. Question is what historical antecedents, the roots that help in why repurposing exists the way it does today in contemporary Mahikeng municipality. The second question speaks to the other dissertation chapters, the broader project, which is more contemporary in nature and looks at how, why, and through what means Mahikeng residents repurpose space and the consequences. So what do I mean when I'm using this term repurposing? I'm referring to any actions or efforts to transform urban space in accordance with visions or vernacular uses of space other than those originally anticipated by professional planners. And so, for example, that might look like the destruction of the Itsoseng shopping center in the present day Bophuthatswana local municipality between Mahikeng and Lichtenberg. That might look like the subversion of the Independence Stadium, which was originally a state mouthpiece site of spectacle and display. Or it might look like the transformation of Bop TV into a regional Northwest branch of the SABC post-1990s. So to delve quickly into this roadmap, I'm not going to have a lot of time to discuss the literature review on mid-century modernist planning in general, just given the time right now. So I want to go into both the planning for profit system through this lens of the case study Civic Center project, and then look at the tactics of contestation to it that kind of begin to show the roots or the antecedents of contemporary repurposing. And I'm hoping that hopefully I'll get some feedback, some reactions from all of you, both in person and online, so that we can really see in Joburg and then in Mahikeng later this week, because this is an in-progress project, and I would love to change or update things accordingly. So first, this is probably quite familiar to most folks in the audience, but from a perspective, high modernism is marked by kind of state-based planning, a widespread totalizing set of logics over the built environment that indeed include a set of hubris about mastering space and assumptions about terra nullius, or there was nothing there before, right? Historians like Bernard Mbenga, in the case of Mmabatho, have showed that there were people there. A broader and more participatory audience in the context of, say, a more participatory planning regime. Now, if this is high modernism, racial modernism in South Africa was achieved through very specific juridical means as well. So legislation like the Group Areas Act or the Bantu Authorities Act, right? These pieces of legislation aimed to segregate South Africa on a territorial scale and often involved dispossession and forced relocation at a very violent level, and also in connection with Legasik and Volpe talk about as political economic interlocking systems, right? So when we look at the borders of the former South African Bantustans, as one example, it's not coincidental that the borders of the former Bophuthatswana Bantustan in orange were at times just 20 kilometers from what was then the PWV, the present day Gauteng area, such that workers could be enmeshed in a common political economy in factories, in mines, but elsewhere, you would be hours away from the metropolitan center, right? Mmabatho, now Mahikeng Local Municipality, was hours away from this center and served as a sort of site of social reproduction where people could go when they were not working in the migrant labor system, for example, without the state providing any of that revenue. This archival map comes from the Black Sash, and it's from 1975. And this map documents various waves of forced relocation to former South African Bantustans that are ethnically inflected in nature, right? Setswana-speaking people or Basotho people going to different places, right, based on these arrows. And zooming in on the map, it's kind of hard to read, so I'll just read a couple. Itsoseng Bophuthatswana, arrow link, 4 proposed massive labor reserves with 14 towns from Carltonville to Wolmaranstad. Pampierstad Bophuthatswana, crafted as a resettlement township for Africans to allow for diamond diggings from Barkley West and Windsorton, planned for 25,000. Dieplan Bophuthatswana, planned for 45,000, moved from 75 kilometers away. So what we can see in these images, first of all, is that forced relocation didn't happen all at once. It happened through various waves, sometimes 50 people, sometimes 50,000. Forced relocation was often connected to things like resource extraction. Forced relocation was at times declared voluntary and at times very violent. And it's worth noting, there was money in these massive planned relocation centers for 50,000 people at a time, and for all the contractors and city builders who would be involved. So here's the location of Mmabatho. And I'm very indebted to Alan Mabin, who's on the call for this slide. So Regulation R293 of 1962 was the enabling legislation that allowed for urban planning kind of with a carte blanche in the former Bantustans. In this particular case, the regulation basically stated that quote, until the Bantu inhabitants have achieved a sufficient these interim regulations could be controlled. And so the government authorities could basically have a carte blanche to lay out townships. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Mmabatho. So this government gazette shows the firm Maloslu, Huff and Partners, and they were the firm with links to Wits University, in fact, that laid out the plan for Mmabatho. And so what you can see are a set of residential units located here. And these residential units were set to have different population groups, different size lots, and were located around Siwa. This is a slide of what a residential unit might look like with the individual plotted out residences. And this is a satellite overview map of what Motsiwa Unit 2 looks like today. This was the archival map of Motsiwa Unit 2 from the Northwest, present day satellite overview of the same area. But we might also see that this kind of large plan is not unique to the Bantustan era. So at left, we have photos I took from the Roy Grand area, which these were kind of mass-built homes by Maloslu Huff and Partners during that era. And on the right, we have RDP homes in the Extension 39 era, post-apartheid. And hopefully one might be able to see that there are indeed some resemblances. But just like we've gone from a kind of macro territorial geography of provinces, district municipalities, and local municipalities, so we have a repurposed territory in the post-apartheid era, my question is, what do these kind of more everyday neighborhoods this is sort of the overview about the ways architecture and urban planning were used strategically for a dual role. One, to build state legitimacy, and two, to enrich this elite network. And it's just worth noting just how much money going into urban planning. So looking at the national account figures, which it's worth noting are dubious figures at best, right? These are state mouthpiece figures, and folks like Laura Phillips have noted that there are a lot of problems with them. But nonetheless, between 25 to 50% of total government expenditures and 70 to 85% of gross fixed investments were going to planning and community development during the 1970s. So what kind of projects were being constructed? Well, on the right, we have the Harona we have a kind of rendering sketch of it. And to the left, we have the case study planned project that I'm looking at today, the Mmabatho Civic Center. This was designed by architects Banny Brits and Michael Scholes, and they would connect via a pedestrian walkway. And this would become a very important detail for a lot of my interviewees, those who express kind of a nostalgia for or a belief in the ethnic Tswana nature of the project, noted the importance of the horseshoe, as you might see in the Harona layout, noted the importance of, quote, the buildings all connecting together through the various breezeways, and noted that the breezeway itself was an ethnic Tswana architectural feature. Similarly, of interest would be different materials like the use of platinum or even trees like the jacaranda tree. And this gets to a broader point I'm making about scripts, because, you know, when one interrogates, you know, well, what is the ethnic Tswana or the Setswana heritage around platinum? It gets quickly complicated as mining interests come into play, right? When one asks about the historical significance of the jacaranda tree to Setswana culture, it's similarly really complicated, right? Because the jacaranda tree actually originates in Latin America, but also has ties to Gauteng, right? But nonetheless, these are kind of mentioned as ethnic Tswana architectural features by different interviewees. Now, in contrast, we have the Mmabatho Independent Stadium, which was designed by an Israeli architect, Israel Gudovich, and which used a formal, functional form. I was able to interview the architect, and he noted that, quote, there was no symbolic architecture here, end quote, pointing to the fact that he had only a 9-month timeline to construct the stadium and limited financial resources from the Bophuthatswana Finance Ministry. And so for him, it was purely functional. He was worried that an elevator or an escalator would break. And so these ramps were meant to allow for evacuations as quickly as possible for tens of thousands of people. So again, it's not necessarily symbolic. In this case, it's mostly functional. Now, of course, there's also the aspect of state legitimacy and urban planning. Here we have BOP Airways, right? At one point, this was the second largest runway on the African continent. We also have agricultural extension clusters, and we also have a BDF and SADF training complex. So this gets to another aspect of the purpose of urban planning, right? The fact that this very expensive and large complex was actually to be used for joint military exercises between the Bophuthatswana Defense Forces and the South African apartheid-era defense forces, which, you know, finances could be fungible, and, you know, various public projects could perhaps help different actors at the same time. So in the paper, I identify the network in greater depth. I won't go over it here for the sake of time, but I will note, you know, what ambiguous dual role in the network. On the one hand, he was a personal beneficiary. His compound at Lehurutsi village would take days or a day probably to walk through, and that was financed with public money. On the other hand, you also had you know, President Mangope's residence in Mmabatho with the chandelier and the bathtub that's now been repurposed to the traditional affair. But in the context of the Civic Center, which is where I'll kind of conclude, I took a look at the various ethnic Tswana architectural details and also looked at the contracts, bids, and subcontracts for the project itself. And so in this particular course, you might see that the winning firm, Stocks and Stocks, sorry, there it is, was awarded the tender bid, but did not have the lowest price of all bids on offer. But in addition, if we take ancillary firms, so I'm looking at everything from the solar blinds to the carpets to the toilets to detailing and fabrication, right? All the contractors, well, most all of them actually also were busy constructing projects in other apartheid-era Bantustans too, the Transkei, Venda, and elsewhere. And so a lot of these firms, these were their addresses, right? You might see Sandton, Alberton, Edenvale, right? So these firms were Gauteng-based or Joburg-based, regime-connected, and not necessarily ethnic Tswana in nature, right? There were not Setswana-speaking people leading these firms, nor were there really beneficiaries, right? And so a lot of this stuff comes out with the Scaia Commission for Inquiry. I think we're getting to the end here. So I'll just provide, three quick highlights from the archives. One is a contract between Bophuthatswana and the Israeli contractor Degam Systems over a 10 million rand contract in 1988 rand, I should mention, described as, quote, tainted with fraud. Over 4 million of that 10 million rand contract was just to basically include illicit payments to other officials. There was likewise concern about the relationships between Mangope and Israeli businessman Shabtai Kalamanovitz. He was, quote, a businessman of dubious repute, according to the archival folder I was looking at by John Saylor. Jailed later as a KGB-connected spy. And allegations claim that Mangope used public to pay for Kalamanovitz's bail. You also have Ruth Rees, a Bophuthatswana government representative in London, who was paid to go on a costly fact-finding trip to South Africa, all expenses paid, tickets for herself and her partners. Those air tickets alone amounted to over 5. In general, there were kind of gross disparities in government wages and the amount on the kind of listed dockets of the official Bophuthatswana budget. And so kind of where does this leave us? This leaves us with kind of a complicated dual role for the system of urban planning that we can look at today, right? On the one hand, we see that urban planning helped kind of grease the wheel of this network. It included folks in the United States like Ron Greenwald in New York. It included folks in Israel. It included folks like Rowan Kronji in former Rhodesia. And it included many folks in the apartheid South African government. But on the other hand, buy-in among forcibly relocated residents that this regressively planned town could perhaps be for them. And indeed, in a future presentation, I'll bring in more of the interviews and the contemporary, because the numerical majority of my indeed believe that this kind of urban planning regime was planned for them. And that in the context of Mmabatho anyway, was visionary and was ethnically doing through this archival foray is that this is not ethnic Tswana architecture. This is a pastiche, a cheap copy, an imitation, and it's done for profit. And I'm also arguing that there's a bit of Gramscian hegemony at play. In other words, even though residents were paying in 2 rand, 50 cents at a time to this project, I'd love to take some questions.
Okay, thank you for that fascinating and insightful presentation, Stefan. I read the paper just before the seminar, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading the paper. And I mean, it says a lot about the political processes in Bophuthatswana, which, I mean, now, especially when you mention nostalgia, I always have these conversations with my colleagues, particularly they mention Mmabatho Stadium, and they have this nostalgic conversations, moments, remembering to what was in Mangope's contribution. So I think that adds a lot to that discussion, to those processes. Particularly what I think is more implicit is also the political processes just behind Bophuthatswana, which I feel is lacking in our academic discourses. So anyway, so I'm going to open the discussion to everyone, our colleagues here in the room and our colleagues online. So if you're online, you can show by raising your hand, or you can use the chat section. I'll read that for the benefit of everyone. And so I will take a round of 3 questions each, if that's the case. If that doesn't work, we can always keep the discussion going. We can take each question at a time. So, yeah. Yes, so, okay, I think. Yeah, so Ariana is a question, and so yeah.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, for the really interesting paper and presentation. I just want to challenge you a bit on the issue. I'm not quite convinced by the argument around the Gramscian hegemony. And I think that the nostalgia today might play a part in giving that impression. That if it was really true that these buildings and public spaces had such meaning for people, I think you would not have the repurposing that you would have today. So just, otherwise I thought it was a great paper, really interesting material. But I wanted to push you a bit on that question. Oh, and then while I'm here, let me ask you, maybe something that you want to add to your discussion of this planning of public space in terms of racial modernity. Something that you don't quite mention is in the paper is the issue of ethnic identity and essentialized, like it was about an ethnic project, and maybe something you want to basically bring into that discussion. Thanks.
There's a question online from Kibuhlale, and then you can go ahead, Kibuhlale. I'm sure we'll be able to hear you from the projector speaker that we have on this end. You can go ahead and ask.
Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Hi.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. I'm sorry, Kibuhlale, we cannot hear you. Is it possible maybe to type in the question or comment, and then I'll reach out to bring everybody together into the discussion.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, and then in the room, do we have any further questions? Yes. And sorry, could you come closer to the
Thank you for the paper. It's very, very interesting. And I think there has been a lot of very fascinating work on Bophuthatswana in recent times, so sort of adding to it in all sorts of interesting ways. I wonder, I mean, it does seem to me as though a large part of Mangope and the Bophuthatswana elite's aims was to create viable employment in Bophuthatswana as well. And it seems, I mean, certainly if you look at probably the even bigger project of Sun City, there was a driving, and I'm sure a lot of the similar kinds of issues apply there in terms of corruption, contracts, etc., etc. But there was a driving, driving need to create viable employment within the boundaries of Bophuthatswana itself, which I think seemed to be really crucial motivation there, to create the tourism through the gap they had with gambling, etc., etc. That they saw a way of creating some really viable employment, and therefore extending the apartheid project by trying to create somewhat more viable Bantustan. So I just think, I mean, just to get beyond the sort of the issues of simile of imagery, and it seemed to be quite a blunt material need to create employment at all costs.
Okay, thank you for that question. I see we have 2 more questions. So let me, while I try to figure out how we can get our colleagues online to be able to speak and be heard here, I'll give Stefan a chance to answer those 2 questions, and then we'll progress.
Hi, Tabi, so I'm back.
Take these 2 questions that are online.
Oh.
And I hand back. You had a question too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can, for now, I think you can respond to those two while we try to figure out how we can get.
Okay, so lots of questions, and thanks to you both for those. I think this is kind of the reason why I wanted to be here in person in Joburg, is to get these reactions and continue to work on the paper, because yes, Ariana, the repurposing speaks exactly to the fact that the hegemony is not a totalizing or monolithic response, and it never was, right? The contestation in the 1980s with the coup attempt, the destruction of the very civic center itself, right, all to tremendous dissatisfaction, and the vast civil society organizing with Bophuthatswana Coordinating Committee, MAREF, the Mahikeng Anti-Repression Forum. So this was, I guess, I would say in my interviews, it was almost 50-50. There was this contingent of people who really believed in the Mangope vision on its face and sought to infuse a set of ethnic Tswana architectural scripts in explanation of. And then there was an equal 50% who were but on the other hand, people were lashed and there was police brutality. So interviewees would hold both ideas at one side of the police. But then, I think that, so I agree fully that the repurposing speaks to a tremendous dissatisfaction among many with these architectural projects. But neither the repurposing nor the politics of hegemony and now nostalgia, neither are totalizing. They're both contested, I think. With regard to the ethnic nationalism, I think what I'm getting, and I think this is right, is that this needs to be further emphasized in the paper. I don't know if anybody here knows Majuta Motlane. He's working really on this ethnic nationalism aspect, and I'm learning a lot from him. But yes, the idea of creating a Tswana nation through the built environment is a key way in which these public architectural projects gain legitimacy locally. So the ethnic nationalism piece is huge. And indeed, that goes all the way to kind of ACDP and contemporary pan-Tswana. It was not too uncommon for me to have an interviewee express dissatisfaction or confusion that a higher up political appointee was Zulu or Xhosa and not Tswana, and this was a source of tremendous frustration for them in Mahikeng today. And so I think it speaks to the fact that Lucas Mangope was operating in a world of contradictions. There was the contradiction between tradition and modernity, between ethnic nationalism and supposed inclusion of Bophuthatswana being worldly and welcome to everyone. And then the idea that it was at once a showpiece architectural center, but also an authoritarian police state. So, it operated amidst these contradictions, I think. And then to this question of employment, I think that's a huge issue, and I emphasize greater depth of the paper, because I think it also helps this question of nostalgia. Because in the 1990s, as things like these vast subsidies from Pretoria gave way to kind of free, all of the agricultural extension services for farmers, gave way to no more, right? This can help explain dramatic instability that then leads to a nostalgia for a materially secure past, right? And so, yes, there were a lot of contracts, there was a lot of graft, but there were jobs, and that they weren't necessarily involved decision-making or prestige when it came to the architecture, and a lot of the profits went to this elite network. But there were beneficiaries all down the line, including civil servants, former civil servants, who were able to travel to Israel, were able to travel to West Germany for the first time in their lives. And it meant a lot to them as well. And then the financing and home ownership regimes were also kind of helping to explain this nostalgia as well. So I'm going to try to emphasize the employment thing a bit more too. Yeah.
It seems to me as though there's a lot of differentiate who's responding to this in terms of who are the Islamic insiders and who are those probably the overwhelming majority who are dependent on either people outside of this community.
Yeah.
Showed that in fact a lot of the people that ended up in permanent employment in complex not from the local community of land, but
I'm gonna try to find. I haven't found anything in the archives yet that would like. I found a lot of these documents for the contract. I'm like, who were the workers who were? I haven't found that. You know, you in Saha archives, you have the Neil Coleman papers, for example, right? That like are showing a lot of really helpful migrant labor. Who are the workers? What are their stories? I'm wondering, you know, was there anything like that in Northwest? So maybe that's something I can try to figure out. Okay, we've got Kebo and Alan maybe.
Okay, so let's try again to bring in our colleagues online. So I'll try to disconnect my my laptop from the project and see how we can, if it can work. So we'll start with Kibohlali and then move on to, I think was it Alan whose hand was up. So if we can get those two, and then maybe one more from the room, and then we can make it around.
Hi, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Great, yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Stefan, for that wonderful and insightful presentation. In fact, I grew up in Mahikeng, and as you were speaking, I had so much nostalgia just listening to you speak about the civic center. I mean, when I was young, I was part of the choir. We would go to that civic center for our choir performances, and we'd have our lunch at that quarter plaza that you have insightfully spoken about. And thank you so much for all of that. That's interesting. So I have then a question with regards to the Mabana Arts, Culture and Sports Foundation. You speak a lot about, you know, the architecture of the space as well as the nostalgia that's attached to the space. And Mabana Arts and Culture and Sports Foundation is so key to the youth culture in Mahikeng that, you know, I'm not quite sure if you've touched on it in your paper, but I would argue that I didn't hear enough about it in your presentation. And it's just one of the most important spaces in Mahikeng, only because it has shaped a lot of the youth culture. I know that now it has been burned down. It was burned down in 2018. I'm not quite sure how the space is right now, or whether or not it has in fact been refurbished again. But outside of that, it was a very instrumental and key structure for the youth of Mahikeng. A lot of musicians, entertainers will tell you about how that space specifically played a role in their cultural, artistic and musical and entertainment pursuits. And it would be interesting to hear what you have to say about it in the contemporary and historically, considering the fact that it was burnt down, because we know that Mahikeng as a town is regressing, and a lot of these structures now only hold the nostalgia. The space has shifted and the cultures of space has also shifted, and now we have new conversations about what all those structures mean and what those architectures currently represent in the contemporary. So it would be interesting to hear you speak more about the Mabana Arts and Culture Foundation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Kibohlali. And we will take our next question from Alan, and then we'll have one more from the room, and then that will constitute a round, and then you can respond, Stefan. So Alan, over to you.
Assuming that you hear me, Tabiso.
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much, and thanks especially to you, Thabiso, Antoinette, and Stefan for arranging the possibility of participating from Cape Town. Just the first of all, just 2 comments. One is, this really is remarkable work. So really, it's amazing because you bring so many different things together, Stefan, from the forced removal stuff to so many other issues, and the result is it takes what I would call planning and architectural history a whole lot further than we've seen to date. So that's great. And then the other comment is the 2 points that Ariana made, I think are both significant, actually. The ethnic stuff, the contrast with Soshanguve being the township in the Pretoria Tshwane sort of circuit, which precisely its name is about people excluded from Bophuthatswana. So there's definitely a whole lot to be done there. And but the other comment also about the Gramscian stuff, I'm less qualified to talk about, but I think Ariana's right. Anyway, I suppose 2 very quick small questions, and I'm sure Stefan will talk about this work again. One is, how do you plan, very briefly, to develop the idea, and this is a very self-centered question to ask, I know, how do you plan to develop the idea around the question of modernism? Partly because what is written about modernism is in all sorts of spheres, all sorts of social spheres, historical spheres, whatever, but particularly in relation to planning and architecture, tends in the end to be pretty vague and ill-defined. So have you got thoughts about how you're going to take that further along? You probably have a lot of other material to help you do that. And then if you wanted to hazard a point about, the Bantustan aftermath more generally, how does this compare, with the Ciskei, the Transkei, Leboa? One or 2 small remarks in that sort of terrain. Is it, how unique, if I may abuse the language, how unique is this? Thank you so very much. Thank you, Thabiso, for your excellent sharing too.
Okay, so thank you. Okay, I will take a question from the audience in the room. So I'll bring the laptop to you. I think that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Nice to finally meet you. Nice to meet you, Prof. Lison. I've used quite a bit of your work. Stefan, your presentation was very interesting. I have a few questions in terms of the structures of the houses that were built by Mangope. Last week, I was interviewing a man who says their RDPs during Mangope were very, very big. Now, that would be a man that was of a higher status. He was a government official, because I've also interviewed people of a lesser social standing to him, whose design of the houses is very, very similar. It's the same as what you portrayed in the pictures. Now, I would like to know whether you were able to identify the differences in terms of the buildings that were given to people of a higher social ranking to the ones that were given to ordinary citizens. And then the other question that I have will be based on ethnicity and belonging in Bophuthatswana. Were these structures these these institutions, yes, that's the word I was looking for, where they provided for all areas in Bophuthatswana. I'm doing my research in Hammanskraal, and except for the Babelehi industrial site and the carousel gambling resort, there is no an example of Mabana Cultural Arts Center. There is no big historical, it's only stadiums in the Odi Muretele region. It's only unfinished, if I may use that word, unfinished stadiums or unfinished projects. Thank you. And the other one would be rather not really a question, is the neglect of these institutions by the current government a way of kind of erasing the legacy of Mangope, because they are not as well taken care of as they were during Mangope's time. Thank you.
Okay, a lot there to let's see. Okay, a lot there to talk about pretty briefly. So I guess I'll start with Tebo's points. Yeah, Mabana Arts Foundation. I mean, it's a very, very important aspect of this broader urban planning system that Mangope kind of sought to infuse with both tradition and modernity, taking inspiration from elsewhere, right? Israel, West Germany, elsewhere. And indeed, as you mentioned, it's burned down, right? And so there's a very kind of visceral image when driving by Mabana, and one sees that kind of burned out building that many interviewees have discussed, right? And I definitely think that that's something to further emphasize, given, as you mentioned, the kind of important cultural vitality for many in memory of the Mabana Arts Complex. I will note that in Lonely Park, nearby, there's now a kind of new civic residential association spinoff of Mabana that's a kind of more grassroots, bottom-up version, not a state-created, modernist architectural giant, but instead a kind of much more modest architectural intervention using tents, revitalizing other areas of Lonely Park. And so what I think that might help us discover is how a lot of the artistic and cultural energy of the region came not from a kind of top-down cultural project, but rather from people themselves. And so I've been to this Lonely Park building. I'd like to go back, but that's some of the energy being, and then certainly, connecting with things like the large Casper Nioves concert that's kind of repurposed the stadium in December of this. Cultural life of Mahikeng, is continuing to make new strides. So it's not totally regressing, but it is a complicated path of weaving ups and downs. To Alan, thanks very much for your comments. I think the question about where this might intersect with discourses around modernism. This is where the planning theory work comes in for me, because I think the repurposing conversation that's happening is like African cities, like Liza Sorolia and others, or Abdul Malik Simone. There's a real conversation about kind of trying to reuse these modernist structures for new purposes that might involve care and respect for others, shelter, things like that. So that's one direction where I see this going, is a sort of a landscape designed with hubristic intentions, racist intentions, but now being reappropriated or recontextualized in a more just way. But that being said, I think it's important to keep the political economy really front of center when having some of these conversations. So, modernism is sometimes treated as merely an aesthetic movement. But I think it's key to ground it in, some of these material conditions. And so that's, I guess, where I'm hoping to go with that is to try to bring in the political economy to the aesthetic and then discuss how these places are being kind of reappropriated. To the houses question. So for those in the room, sorry for those on Zoom, but this is a photo from an interviewee who had a house, a relocation house in Itsoseng. And this was the kind of more lower income space of forced relocation, half shack, half house. It was a site and service model where, one would be given a plot, but pretty much a lot of the actual building would be one's own responsibility. And if you see the number on the house, right, this was the 447th house to be built in this section of Itsoseng. The local contractor, this particular interviewee said, was a man named Bandra, who was an Indian migrant who was kind of an intermediary with the architectural firm. So this would be very different, right? Very different than something in Mmabatho Unit 6, for example, which was a civil servant-built public housing, not through site and service model or a contractor, right? But directly through kind of a state organized contract. So I think your point is really, really important. And I was a little rushed in the conclusion, so I should just mention this now. We cannot generalize from Mmabatho to pretty much anywhere else in South Africa, right? It's a very unique story, particularly around nostalgia and these subsidies. In Hammanskraal, you did not have these kind of politics, but even in these other former Bantustan. So this gets to Alan's second question, right? In the former Transkei, in the former Ciskei, there was a very different politics, and there was a very different material and aesthetic language. So this is my friend Jesse. We had the chance to visit the former Transkei and go around Mthatha. And one kind of contrast that we noticed was that there was not this kind of ethnic architectural attempt, right? Pastiche or not, right? There was not such an attempt in Mthatha, right? And Mthatha's downtown does not have these kind of afterlives. So we should discover this as a fairly specific story. And then this question about about neglect by the current government and whether it speaks to a desire to erase Mangope's past, right? Is that sort of so this is a complicated one because on the one hand, I think I've increasingly come to believe that a lot of the architecture built in the late 70s and 80s was not actually of particularly high quality, built to last, such that although it was of monumental grandeur, I don't think that actually it's in very good shape, not only also because in some sense it was in ways of poor quality. And I also think that because of the various contracts with Israel, with West Germany, with apartheid South Africa, there was local knowledge about how to fix things, right? And so whether one had the interest in repairing or not, one might not have known exactly about this specific part or that specific tool. And so because of that, there are a lot of challenges. The current premier of the Northwest, right, Bushi Mape, and some of you might know Sechaba Mape from Wits, right? They have, I have been told that there is definitely interest in and goodwill for repairing the architectural and kind of planning projects of this erstwhile regime, right? So I don't think it's, at least on its face, ill will. But I do think there might be a lack of knowledge, a lack of construction materials, right? And a different system that might speak to why things are in a bit of disrepair as they are today. I don't know if that helps. That's just my perspective, but you might disagree. But okay, I think we're probably over time, so yeah. So.
Yeah. There's a question. Okay, let me bring the laptop closer to you. Just turn on the video.
And then I just wanted to know why particularly Bophuthatswana, not the other although you did touch on Transkei and Ciskei.
Can I ask a very last question? I wanted to ask a very last question in terms, so I see the argument you're trying to make about the repurposing. What you haven't mentioned is the repurposing of these networks of profit post-apartheid. To what extent did they adapt and to a new situation? To what extent were they displaced and replaced by new networks? I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so two really fascinating questions. Yeah, the white elephant question I think is really notable in Mmabatho and former Bophuthatswana, right? When you look at the stadium as one example, or the Mabana Arts Foundation, right? You have these really large public architectural monstrosities, not at all in use, right? And so you see that they serve this very specific political purpose, right? And they're serving what at first blush looks like no purpose. So in the former Transkei, at least, which is the only other Bantustan capital that I've yet been able to visit, you have a different set of architectural articulations, I think. I'd be curious about Bisho. I'd be curious about, other former capitals as well. I do think that even in these white elephant projects, there are new repurposed uses in the interstitial spaces around them. And that should give us all hope for a more popular democratic type of repurposing. So, and I've spoken to Ariana about this, but like the fact that you have a set of informal driving schools in the stadium parking lot, that you have a running track that is kind of an improvised running track around the stadium, and that you even have ephemeral activation events, right? You have drag racing, you have aerobics courses. So yes, these are white elephant monstrosities that look completely burned out and abandoned, but there are new latent uses for these sites, and that should give us optimism, but we should study that more. In terms of the repurposing of the profit networks, I think there is some continuity and there's also some disjuncture. I think this will be a entirely new dissertation chapter, right? This is like a large scope, right? But something like stocks and stocks, right? Stefanuti stocks, as it's called today. If you go to stefanutistocks.com, you will see that they are a major urban planning player globally, right? They'll do projects in Dubai, they'll do projects in Singapore. So clearly, the contracts of the Bantustans, like the Civic Center, were good for stocks, right? They were good for Stefanuti stocks. And the profit networks perhaps have changed, perhaps have adapted, but the firm remains very much intact. Going back to that spreadsheet of all those subcontractors, business and kind of remain sometimes doing government projects, right? So in that sense, it's like, wow, there's a lot of continuity in these networks. But there's also been a lot of change. And in particular, when some of those contesting and helping to destroy the unjust architectural forms are now in the halls of power, right? This adds to a lot of complexity. And when former state planners are now private planning consultants with private consulting firms, right? I spoke with about 3 or 4 people from a firm called Maxim Planning Solutions. They do the spatial development framework, the land use scheme, and all SPLUMA compliance for Mahikeng. But they were all apartheid-era peri-urban division planners, in the 1980s. So there's some changes nominally. You have the local municipality now, but what about the private consultants, right? Who have changed their role, but are still doing a lot of urban planning. So I think this will be another dissertation chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've come to the end of our session. So thank you, Stefan, for that insightful and exciting presentation. And I'm sure the conversation will go on and must go on. So the recording will be made available on our YouTube page, that is the History Workshop page. I'll share the link The link will be shared on social media pages, so look out for that if you want to revisit any of these debates. So thank you to our colleagues online, and thank you to our colleagues here in the room. And thank you again to you, Stefan.
Thank you.